So before we get into this chapter 37, I thought it might be good just to kind of check in and see where we're at in our studies of biology. So we've really gone through a lot of all that diversity in both the plant and animal kingdoms. But just to remind us, we did start out with the three domains. We talked a lot about these ones in chapter 17 and then chapter 18 when we were talking all about the protists. Remember, eukaryotic cells are all protists, fungi, plants, and animals. And so most of our discussion is on eukaryotic cells. And really, when we last talked about anything other than these groupings, we were talking about the level of populations. So populations were what we talked about as that unit of evolution, right? Where populations change. And populations we defined as a group of interbreeding individuals. All of that talk about the species concepts, right? That's what we're talking about with a population. So if I take a look, and this is, I think, worth putting back in the slides for this. This is biology's taxonomy. This is the taxonomic structure that all of biology adheres to. So, you know, we spent in this course a lot of time up here at the top. I did list out all the orders of insects. Most of your biology from this point on would probably be from that point down. And so, you know, we get more and more specific as we move through those levels of taxonomy. And really what we're talking about here with population ecology, which is what we're going to cover in chapter 37, is groups of species or a population. And so that's where we're at in this sort of, part of the course. This slide also comes way back from chapter 1. So this was one of the themes in biology, that biology really adheres to this hierarchical organization or structure. And most of this course has been, you know, working from the teeny tiny, so the micro, to the macro. And so as we work through these last chapters, as we move through, we were talking about organisms and species. And so chapter 37 is going to be about population ecology. Chapter 38 moves on to community ecology. Chapter 40, oops, well, we do cover a little bit of chapter 39 and 38. So chapter 40 is ecosystem ecology. And then we go backwards. Chapter 35 is all on the biomes and the biosphere. So the way I have this structured this semester is your last test is going to be on chapters 37 and 38. So this is the last test. And we do have a project. No final exam, but a project on biomes at the very end. So we're almost there. Everything that we are talking about now is ecology. And so this is a little bit more integrated, and it really allows you to kind of get out and see how things all come together. So the lab that goes along with this, in class we did it in conjunction with this lesson. And I would encourage you to get out there and explore while the weather permits. And see what you can find. So it's really just a checklist. You can take photos of all the different kinds of plants that you can find. So chapter 37, or population ecology, really what population ecologists do is take a look at a population of one species and look at the structure and dynamics of that population, and really try and figure out what are the factors that are regulating that population over time. So we could talk about how populations grow or shrink or stabilize, what the carrying capacity is, you know, what the niche is. There's a number of words that aren't used in this chapter 37 yet, and so I'm going to add them in as we go because I really do think that they're key ecological terms, and I didn't want to add too much to the notes because there's a lot of content already in this course. So as we talk about population ecology, I think case studies or examples are really good, and in your textbook, it talks about a really strange case of the human population. So humans have really sort of switched things up. They don't really follow the rules of even like a top predator ecologically. And so, yeah, it's a bit of a strange case, this human population, but it is an example of population ecology. So hopefully you did the pre-reading and thought about an example of populations. Because I think as you apply these things to a specific example, it can really help. So population ecologists look at the structure of the population. So that would be how many and how they're spread out, the distribution of those individuals. And then they also take a look at the dynamic. So like I said, the interactions, all those factors that cause a change in the population. We could talk about population growth, population stability. We could also talk about a decline. One thing that your textbook does not talk about in addition to these factors is that we have immigration and emigration happening. And that's a pretty significant factor when we talk about these dynamics. And so it really kind of downplays that or doesn't even talk about immigration and emigration, but that is a pretty significant component to why populations are going to change or those population dynamics. So the application of population ecology is really, you know, pretty much everywhere. And probably if you're taking this course, you do have somewhat of an interest in these things. And so we could talk about endangered species or sustainable harvesting of fisheries. We could talk about how wildlife populations are managed. We could also consider, and the one crash course video that I put in was the spread of pests and pathogens. So his case study is on mosquitoes, is not a Canadian example, in Texas, and the population of mosquitoes and the rise of West Nile virus. So it's a little dated, it's about 15 years old as, you know, a current event, but he uses that as a case study to really explain a lot of the concepts of population ecology. And I think that's really useful, like I said, to have those. And then always population growth. So other examples that we talked about in class, just to sort of, you know, broaden your ideas, we could talk about the fisheries of Kootenay Lake, the salmon, the bull trout. They're encouraging people to catch bull trout these days because they are predators of the kokanee salmon, and I think the rainbow trout, but somebody could correct me if you like. In class, we've also talked about the caribou in the area and yeah, the breeding pen and trying to maintain or bring back that population of caribou in the Kootenays. We could talk about forestry issues with wood-boring beetles and different beetle kill issues that have been going on in BC in the forestry sector. There's other ones, interesting animals, wolverine studies. My partner works where they ski, cat skiing, and they have wolverine researchers that work in the area. And so it's really interesting, you know, all these different examples around us. And, you know, population ecology needs data. And it's really interesting to see how we can generate this data. And so the next page here, I get a little sidetracked there. It's way more fun when we can talk about these things, but otherwise just listen to me. Population structure, we could talk about the density and then that distribution. And so in these, this estimation, this sampling is really tricky. We could talk about tracks, right? We could have people out there. In class, we had someone who works in the forestry sector in the summer planting and laying out blocks he's like, you know, we've got an army of people out there seasonally that could be gathering data. A lot of this sampling and counting is is volunteer work. The Wolverine researchers in the Katski tenure would generate their data by hanging chickens up in trees and putting game cams underneath them, because then they could not just count the individuals in the population, but they could also figure out the demographics. So it was important for them to know how many breeding females were in the population. And so, you know, these other sampling techniques, whether it's tracking or photos, it's an interesting thing of who does it and how do they do it. So what they're trying to generate is how many individuals in a given area. And so this is that density, so the number per area. The distribution is also interesting, and different organisms have, or different populations have different patterns. And most of it is dependent on, you know, their interactions with each other and the habitat that they live in. So these examples are the ones from the textbook, but I don't know that I really connect with penguins all that much. It's certainly not a Canadian example. So the most common is a clumped distribution. So these are patches of organisms. In class, we talked about a student with a number of adult ladybugs gathering in their home right now, and they do definitely have a clumped distribution, she was explaining. They gravitate to heat. I think of a clumped distribution, if you've ever seen 5-year-olds play soccer, that is a clumped distribution because they've one resource in their soccer game, and that is the ball. So you can imagine it that way. And then also minnows. If you're in the lake, you can see little schools of fish, and they are in clumps. The next one would be a uniform distribution. And so the example from the textbook is talking about penguins, but like I said, I don't really connect with those as much. We can think about top predators. So we think about bears, especially grizzlies, cougars, hawks is another example. Or you might want to think about, you know, not kids playing soccer this time, but people on a bus or people in a waiting room. I mean, it's sort of social convention that people come in and they spread out evenly. So this uniform distribution. Random distribution is relatively rare, but all wind dispersed plants. And so finish my thought there. Wind dispersed plants like dandelions, they just grow where they blow to, really. And so if the seed hits a patch of favorable dirt, that's where it's going to be. And so that distribution is random because the seed distribution is random. So population ecologists love math. They love graphs. They love mathematical models. So models, equations, graphs, all of these things. Because what they're trying to do is understand what's going on and predict how a population size might change over time or under different conditions. And so if there is a threat to that habitat, what can we project as the population growth or decline, I guess. So the two basic models that almost are never actually realized in the real world is exponential growth or logistic growth. So exponential growth might be fruit flies in your kitchen where it just goes up and up and up and up and up. So there'd be no restriction, you know, they just kind of go up forever. These are really rapid, and there's not a limit to it. Although, as we're going to see, rarely do we have this unchecked forever. Logistic growth reaches a maximum. And so there's some kind of a limiting factor that is going to have a carrying capacity reached. So that's how the habitat or the environment limits the growth or the size of the population. So these are the two examples showing those graphs a little bit neater than what I just drew. Without any limiting factors, rabbits are a good example of this going on forever. I know the University of Victoria had a real problem with rabbits, and then someone was talking in class about how they brought in predators, and now they have a problem with whatever predator it was that they brought in. I forget the details. The other one would be logistic, and so here you can see this is the maximum. This is the carrying capacity because there is a limitation on most populations. So like I said, growth is rarely purely exponential or purely logarithmic. We've got a lot of factors, and these factors are constantly changing. And so there's two different kinds of factors. We could talk about density dependent factors. So, as the population grows, how things change, or density independent factors. So it doesn't matter what the population size is at, there's going to be things that can happen that affect that population. So in these density dependent factors, we've got key rates of birth and death rates changing because there is competition as that population increases and food and space become limited. And so examples of these would be increased predation, increased disease transmission, you get too many, accumulation of toxic waste products, or changes in the physiological condition. So sometimes interactions between these organisms. So here's some examples of, things that are real. So this would be a birth rate changing and a death rate, so survival rates decreasing here. So these are ways you could measure different metrics that do affect the overall size of the population. In the videos that I linked on the Moodle site, there's a lot more in the mathematical modeling. I went a little light on that because I think it gets a little bit mathy on us, but there's lots of interesting details about K-selected and R-selected species and how that works. So those would be, the ones that I just talked about would be density dependent. The density independent factors are more about random things that happen. So we could think about abiotic factors like weather or seasonal changes, temperature. I made this one red. Fire is pretty significant around us right now, and what that does, it's obviously a habitat disruption, maybe by human activity, unfortunately. So all of these density independent factors can change the population. And I put this graph in because this is pretty much my garden. And I've got some lupins that like to self-seed, and I always have aphids come in, and I wait for these really hot temperatures that cause a sudden decline in my aphid population. And so these could be, anything that isn't dependent on the size of the population, but just those abiotic factors, those environmental factors generally, that cause an impact to that population size. With the aphids in my garden, there is a boom and bust cycle, and often my aphid population is affected by the temperature, but I also have a healthy ladybug population. So maybe it's an aphid ladybug interaction. And so, it's never as simple as like just one factor. It's never just density dependent or density independent. Sometimes there's dramatic fluctuations in density because there's another population that changes in conjunction with this. And so these boom and bust cycles are more realistic and are common throughout the Kootenays. So you might want to think about it in the number of berries and bears. Oops, that says beers, not beers, bears. The example from our textbook is snowshoe hares and lynx. You could also talk about the number of cougars and deer, and those two populations are closely matched. And so this is really the link into the next level of ecology that we're going to talk about as community ecology, because that's where we take a look at more than one population that is interacting. And so, yeah, that's kind of the end of our population ecology as it relates generally to the world, but this is about the human population. So like I said, there's another video on the Moodle site that does the population growth, the human population growth, but you can see it's somewhat terrifying to consider what is the carrying capacity of Earth. How many people can Earth sustain? So for a long time, there was this kind of slow growth, and then all of a sudden there was a rapid growth. Our fastest growth, our steepest slope or biggest slope would be in the 60s. And so that's when we were really seeing advances in medicine, or the effects of the advances of medicine in lower death rates, increased survival rates, improvements to nutrition and sanitation. All of these things really caused an increase in the human population. And so, like I said, the human population is sort of weird. It seems to have escaped a lot of, the effects that we see on other populations in the wild. But the population is still growing, and it's still growing quickly. Interestingly, a couple of weeks ago, as I make this video, province of BC has the lowest birth rates. So birth rates are something that have been in the news lately. And BC had a birth rate of 1 child per female. I think in Canada it was 1.3 or 1.4 children per woman. And so these birth rates are lower. So we're assuming you need 2 people to make a baby. And so this would mean that our population is declining. And so as an example, Canada is reliant on immigration right now if we want our population to remain stable. Like I said, the idea of what is the carrying capacity is an interesting question. And then we could also take a look around the world. These the rate of growth is different in different countries. And so, like I said, Canada has a pretty low birth rate, but a lot of developing nations have an increasing birth rate right now. And so your textbook talks about Mexico as an example. And it's not just about the birth rate or the death rate, it's about the demographics or the age of the population. And so we could talk about how a population can have momentum. And so, it has enough females at reproductive age to increase the population or maintain it. As an example of this that isn't an international example, the school system here has to contend with shifting demographics this way, where, different years have different number of students in them, and then that affects the resources at the school level. So just an example is not just the number, but it's also how those numbers are spread out, or the demographics that are important in population ecology.